All right, looks like we are live. Looking like levels are good. All right, welcome to episode 3 of the WA lecture series. I'm almost tempted to say the inaugural WA lecture series, given that it's been a really long time since the last one. And I'm actually curious enough now to double check. My first guess was that the last one was maybe early 2019. Let's check on that. Yeah, so July 2019, actually, the last two, actually pretty much back to back. We had two, and then none since, unfortunately. So, first things first, I'll throw it out there. Check out the officer manual for criteria on attendance. Of course, officers normally in a year will have to either attend 3 of these or host one. And if anyone, even if you're not an officer, would like to host one, please let me know. I'm open to any WA topics or even WA related topics. So that includes games WA plays and such. Um, yeah, so given that we kicked this off about September, I'm only requiring officers to attend one or host one for the rest of the year here. Now, you can either attend here in Sir Hauler, which does count, of course. You can also attend in Twitch chat. I do ask that you type something in Twitch chat and remain in Twitch chat the whole time. That will count as attending. And lastly, you can watch the YouTube VOD. This will be up on YouTube shortly after it ends. And then just either leave a comment or DM me just something like 4 to 5 sentences, just comments and or questions about the lecture. So maybe something you found interesting, something that surprised you, just anything else really, just thoughts you might have. In particular, because the subject of today's lecture is the history of WA organization and command structure, I think you may have thoughts on maybe past systems that worked that you think sounded quite good, or maybe if you were an older member, you were around during and you liked them. So maybe you have thoughts on comparing and contrasting different systems, and we'll be going up through our system today as well. So you're more than welcome to comment on comparing past systems to our current system, what you like and dislike about past and the current one, etc. Anything like that. So that gives people ideas as to what to do for YouTube comments. Again, there will be more lectures. I myself promise I will do more before the end of the year, and probably more sooner rather than later, hopefully. So I'm not intending to just do one more December 31st or something like that. Yeah, so that's kind of the attendance deal. So I think we'll probably just kick things off in just a moment here. All right, so the history of WA organization and command structure. So as an overview of this, I'm going to be talking primarily about things from the top-down perspective, mostly because that's how historically WA has named its eras to a degree. For example, the fleet system is usually led by a fleet admiral, unsurprisingly, whereas the empire systems usually led by an emperor. And even if the underlying structure changed to a significant degree, for example, during the Second Empire era, which is the longest WA era to date, we had multiple emperors throughout that era. In fact, we had 4. So every emperor that's ever been leading WA led it during the Second Empire era. Only 2 led it outside of that era. But going back to my point, the example is during the Second Empire era, there was multiple different systems of organization. So at first, we had fleets within the Second Empire's organization, so the emperor, and then going down into different fleets led by admirals. Later, we had legions led by legates, so we had the First Imperial Legion and the Second Imperial Legion. And later on, we would even be broken up into having a sword arm of the Empire and shield arm of the Empire. Basically, we're concerned with affairs outside of the clan and then inside the clan. In theory, there's a little bit of crossover there. The actual reality was the sword arm of the Empire was in charge of all of the knights and knight orders of the clan. And their job was to look outward to new games, to supporting new platforms and new establishments and outposts on new games for the clan. Hence the looking outward, whereas the shield arm was in charge of the traditional chain of command structure, established games and operations on those. So you can see there was a lot that happened in the Second Empire era, but the whole thing was one era. There was even a point during that when there's some different groups established, such as the rank of lawman and lawgiver. And we also had a Praetorian Guard and a Varangian Guard, both established for various purposes and then kind of disappearing not so long after. So it was really an era of a lot of change. And I know a lot of people have pointed to maybe the last 5 years as having a fair amount of change. And well, I don't think that's wrong. I think it's interesting to compare it to the Second Empire era, as the rate of change is actually pretty similar, wherein a lot of times things will sit around for a year, maybe a year and a half, and then things will be changed up. So if you look after the Second Empire, you can point specific points there, but I don't want to get too much further into that time because I'd like to proceed through this chronologically. So we'll kick things off with, we'll go all the way back to about 1998, 1999. So 1998, we're talking about the release of StarCraft Brood War, the expansion to StarCraft. Actually, I should double check on that. That's going by my memory here. Yes, okay. So StarCraft, March 31st, 1998 was the release date. Brood War was December 18th, 1998. So only 9 months later. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with StarCraft, RTS, real-time strategy game, certainly not the first RTS, and it was in fact 2D rather than 3D. And not Blizzard Entertainment's first RTS either. They had other games that they had already created. Some of those including Diablo and Warcraft. So StarCraft came out, and one of the big things with StarCraft and Warcraft 3, which would come out not long after, was custom games. And I think a lot of people would agree that custom games are a huge component of why StarCraft is still popular today and why it was popular for so long. So 1998, 1999, StarCraft was really came out and was highly successful. And what Blizzard did is they established what we call BattleNet or Battle.net. Now, this wasn't, they did create a website for it, but what it actually was basically just the online component of playing the game StarCraft and the other games Blizzard had. So the reason they created this was so that people could interact via chat and chat channels across games. So you could be playing Diablo, Diablo 2, Warcraft, Warcraft 2, Warcraft 3, or sorry, not the original Warcraft. Pretty sure. I can't remember the exact compatibility there. But anyway, various Warcraft games, Diablo, Diablo 2, StarCraft. You could be playing any of those, and you could still join a chat channel and talk to people. Now, obviously, you couldn't play Diablo with somebody who was on StarCraft, but you could still interact. So essentially, you had a number of different Blizzard games all on one platform, which was Battle.net. So this was hugely popular, and essentially there came a need for there came a need for clans, essentially. Simply because you had lots of people playing these games, and naturally people want to form these groups, find people to play with. So the idea became that you needed to have some kind of organization, and you could establish certain things to separate yourself from other clans. So different things were done. For example, rules that were in place. And as a component of that, clan chat channels existed as well. So Blizzard had their own channels established that everyone would automatically join, but clans could actually create their own chat channels. Now, this was a function via Warcraft 3. So with Warcraft, you could create a clan chat channel by using a bunch. The idea was you could get 10 of your buddies that all play Warcraft, get together and make your own clan, and all the ranks were using orc ranks from Warcraft, so Thrall, Shaman, Chieftain, etc. Or not Thrall, sorry, Thrall's character. Grunt was the rank for just an average member. But of course, people made what they call bots or scripts that could just pretend they could impersonate a game client of Warcraft or Diablo or StarCraft. But generally, Warcraft was the most useful one. Warcraft 3 was the one that was typically done, Warcraft 2 sometimes as well. And Diablo to a lesser extent. But Warcraft 3 being the most common and useful bots generally. So clan chat channels were put together with these Warcraft 3 bots, generally speaking, sometimes by 10 actual people playing Warcraft, but one person could do it just with a bunch of bots. Now, you did need a Warcraft CD key to do that, so a lot of... You can look at WoA history and the history of WoA warfare, clan warfare, if you will, as a history of competition for Warcraft CD keys is an interesting way to look at it. It's not completely accurate, but it gives you a decent idea of the picture, because you can see once these clans get established, they create their own clan channels by having 10 or more Warcraft CD keys. Then all of a sudden, those are kind of their home bases, their castles, if you will. And clan wars would be an effort to take over those clan channels, and often to take over websites and forums the clans have created for themselves as well. So all this is being established here. We go back to 98 and 99, and you get into the earliest clans that would be created. And as I said, they would want to differentiate themselves. So something they would do would, for example, be to have rules in their clan channel, such as having to call superior ranked members of the clan sir, or sometimes ma'am, and also to have rules such as saluting when you enter the channel, rules such as certain information you had to have in your profile on battle.net. So there is some fields for text, like a description, and you could put in, say, your rank and that you belong to this clan. Generally, you had to make a new account on battle.net because you couldn't change your username. You just had to make a new account with the clan tag. So, for example, WA hyphen and then your name. Now, some clans would have very specific rules and regulations on what kind of tag you could have, whether you could be off tags. You know, something like having one part of the clan tag, you know, a lowercase when it shouldn't be, could have been a big issue for these clans that were trying to be much more organized. So you really had to divide between people that were just kind of goofing off and people that said, we want to have this organized clan with very strict rules and protocol. So into this space, a few different clans appeared, one of which would be the Jedi Academy Masters, or JAM. Now, JAM considered themselves an empire. That was their organization. And into JAM strode some various early WA figures, including Dane, who would go on to found WA. So JAM would have a huge influence using some of those things like protocol, saluting, etc. These were done by JAM. And that's, as far as we know, the origin of those practices. Obviously, they're taken from actual military practices, but the implementation of them in clans on Battle.net we trace back to JAM. So Dane took these ideas, will go on to found WA June 1st, 2001, and thus began the First Fleet era. So founders included also Varsis of old, who you may know, and early on as well, Sir Warrior Royal Knight of the Bunker. So all of these guys together would form WA. Warrior is traditionally credited with coming up with the name Warriors of Aesir, but it's obviously that's going to be something divisive. Other people are going to claim that they did. So it's unknown the total level of veracity of that claim, but there seems to be some truth to that, quite possibly. The First Fleet era, basically Dane talked about retroactively as having not felt that his new fledgling clan, his dream was to make it an empire. He wanted to be an emperor and lead an empire, but he only wanted to do it when he felt that the clan deserved that title. He felt that it needed to be a prestigious, huge, well-organized clan in order to justify being an empire. So he began things as just a mere fleet, with himself as the fleet admiral. Now, obviously, things didn't last terribly long, as was this was 2001, those early years especially, and going on through most of the existence of Battle.net, clans would rise and fall, month to month. It was very, very common, and a lot of the people playing the game were very young, and were prone to just letting the emotions get better of them, or just trolling online effectively. And people would constantly leave and betray clans, and there was constantly these clan wars, new clans being created, clans being destroyed, new websites and forums being made, somebody infiltrating those and then bringing them down or sabotaging them, constantly new channels being made, channels being taken over. Various methods were used, but a common method was to basically spam a clan channel by having spam bot accounts continually join and spam messages. And if you did that enough, oftentimes you could just overload the bots of that clan channel, whose job it was to ban spammers and ban anyone that wasn't allowed in the channel. So by just spamming repeatedly, it's sort of like a DDoS attack, the channel, sometimes you could get all of the bots to drop, and that would essentially delete the clan. And somebody else could come in and make the clan themselves and essentially steal your channel. So that was a fundamental part of this. Now, there's other shenanigans, like people trying to hack, if you will, and that certainly was done. It really just varies from situation to situation. So it was a chaotic landscape. And this kind of thing would involve WA quickly. We had the Ragnarok early on. In January of 2002, WA was kind of on the decline until that point. It was basically shattered by the Ragnarok. And you can read more about the Ragnarok specifically. We won't get into that too much. The only thing to mention relevant to our lecture today is there was essentially no organization and no communication. When you did have a big clan with a lot of people, it was very vital. You had a website and forums to be able to coordinate, because the clan channel, people would stop in from time to time and say something, but there was no lasting permanence. The most permanent thing was the bots could look back in their logs on their computer and see who typed what. And that was very important and useful to see if somebody said something they shouldn't have, somebody broke a rule, track if somebody had been active or not. The same way we do on Discord, but much, much, much more annoying and less efficient. That said, the alternative, or rather the complement to that, was the website and clan forums, which would allow people to communicate permanently in a way, and not necessarily instantaneously, but people would check the forums and the website very, very often, and often that was required, especially for higher ranking members, to constantly be checking that, administrating it, etc. So when all that stuff went down in the Ragnarok, total disaster. WA would reform in what we called the Stand era. This was Hope/Stand. Now, this wasn't literally WA. It was a successor clan formed by Varsus of Old, St. Dippity Dog, the Scourge of Spies, and the Great Recruiter, and St. Dane the Proud. So together, they would form Hope/Stand to essentially avenge WA. This was Dane thinking this was actually his last stand. Essentially, this was his last clan. And again, vengeance was the idea here. So Hope/Stand was what they call a wartime clan in WA history. So Hope/Stand would fight various other clans, most famously the Mighty Masters of Mayhem, most frequently through a random recruit named St. Sanctifico the Conqueror that was brought in by Dippity. And he was very skilled in trying to steal keys, websites, infiltrate them, take over clan channels. All of this clan war business that is dramatized as a kind of medieval or Viking or pre-modern warfare in many of our sagas and such. Well, that was Clan Wars, and that was Sanctifico's game. He's generally considered the best to ever do it, possibly on Battle.net, certainly a competitor for that title, as far as we know with our history and knowledge of the era. So Sanctifico was very successful in destroying or maiming a number of clans that had animosity towards WA or had wronged WA in some way, featuring members that former members that had betrayed the clan and such. So moving on past the Stand, we don't know a lot about the Stand's organization. We do know that a lot of various ranks were used, and that there was the first usage of houses. But at this point, houses were essentially just divisions. They weren't based on lineage or anything like that. You just joined a house. So essentially, Dane just got together and said, we're going to make some arbitrary different groups, some of them specifically looking for maybe only members who played a certain game, say Diablo members, something like that. So if you're familiar with warbands or platoons, going back to that, very, very similar to that. So this was the first instance of houses, the word houses being used in WA, but in a very different sense. So Hope Last Stand would pretty quickly fade away after a few more months of warfare. Eventually, WA would be reformed with the Second Fleet era. This was in 2003, and this was after Dane stopped back on Battle.net, was convinced to reform WA by St. Loki the Savior. So Dane put WA back together, once again a fleet admiral. Now at this point, a lot of early platoons that had kind of existed in Hope/Stand, some of them even, or traced their origins there, would be formed or restarted. So a few you can look at, such as the Eye of Odin, the Teutonic Order. Some of you may have heard of those. Those are famous divisions and platoons on StarCraft. It's worth kind of just using the phrase division/platoon because a lot of names such as those were both divisions and platoons, or rather, were a division or a platoon at various points in WA history. Now, if we look at that era, again, it was a pretty standard. This was probably the first time that WA was really organized in the more modern fleet sense, because we look at there being a lot of divisions and platoons, and WA truly being a multi-game clan, because new efforts were being established on lots of different games. Mech Assault, Freelancer, Chrome Hounds, World of Warcraft, StarCraft, Warcraft, Diablo, all these different games. So WA had always considered itself a multi-game clan because it was a Battle.net clan, and Battle.net already had multiple different games. You couldn't really be a StarCraft clan entirely because you needed those Warcraft bots or accounts to be able to make a clan channel. So you really had to kind of embrace those multiple Blizzard games at the very least, but venturing to other non-Blizzard games, WA really began to establish itself in that way. So we look beyond that, the Second Fleet era, that would head into the First Empire era. So this was WA's peak, many people would say. Certainly it was set at the time, and in the years after this was the peak for WA. So WA's membership reached very, very high levels. It's always hard to say because a lot of times WA membership numbers are inflated. So for example, if we look back at our peak in 2018, we counted 160 members in WA. But a lot of these people were inactive, had not been seen in 6 months to a year on the server. But we simply left them with their roles, counted them, etc. But at the same time, you can't look at a number like 160 and say, oh no, we weren't active at all. Even with the exaggerations, it does tell you something. It tells you that things were pretty lively. We were pretty active. So you look at the First Empire era, you can say pretty conclusively that WA was at a, if not its zenith, a very, very high point. To the point that Dane felt at the end of the Second Fleet era that it was time to declare it an empire, that he had achieved that legacy, lived up to the legacy of JAM, Jedi Academy Masters, way back from 1999 to 2000. So at this point, WA became an empire. So the idea being that Dane was emperor, that he would have a council composed of various high-level officials, ministers. The emperor's hand was post often occupied by Euler the Trader's Bane. And these would be high-level ranks that weren't attached to a specific division, platoon, or game or anything. They're basically just a group whose job it was to advise Dane and make decisions along with him. Technically, Dane would have veto power with the council, but the idea was that there be a little bit of checks and balances there. Of course, not to a great degree. This was still an emperor leading an empire. So there's a lot of different divisions and platoons still during this First Empire era. As far as it's known, the ranks were still the same going back to perhaps even the First Fleet era, but certainly the Second Fleet era, as far as using the military naval ranks, which has been a long time tradition of WA that we continue in a very similar form today. So those ranks being, of course, generally, so it started with Seaman, which would later change to Crewman, going up to a third-class petty officer, second-class petty officer, first-class petty officer, chief petty officer, master chief petty officer of the Navy, and then moving on to the officer ranks, warrant officer, ensign, lieutenant junior grade, lieutenant, commander, captain, and then usually various admiral ranks. So you'd have rear admiral, vice admiral, admiral, and then the fleet admiral leading. That was the fleet system. But you look at the Empire system, things were changed somewhat. Most significantly at the top is what we're looking at. So again, Emperor's Hand. There was a council, including ministers who had various duties, generally across the entire empire. Things are more spread out, so a lot of times the fleet system originated as being more Battle.net focused, even though WA was still a multi-game clan. The focus was on Battle.net. The idea was that an empire would contain multiple fleets, so therefore maybe one fleet would be Battle.net, another would be World of Warcraft or what have you. So you can look back, and I encourage you to check out Vesburger's archives, and as well the Dane Edda, within which will have information, some historical information, including censuses from 2006. That's a good year to look at for the First Empire era. So the Empire did very well, but eventually it would start to decline. And once again, just as the transition from Second Fleet to First Empire happened, now a transition from First Empire to Third Fleet happened. And this would have been 2008, early 2008. The thought was that WA had shrunk, had kind of things were on the decline, and it was in need of switching to the fleet system. Once again, or so Dane felt. So Dane would switch things back to the fleet system, once again take up the rank of fleet admiral, various rear admirals, vice admirals, admirals, including Puck the Vigilant, Harold, also known as Bender 1968, and Euler, and Warrior. So effectively you had the Admiralty, with those including Dane himself as fleet admiral. Below him, directly below the Admiralty rather, would be the captains of each division. Now, traditionally from this point on, WA really only had one central division for a long time, which was the Eye of Odin, the StarCraft division, which contained various platoons that may have formerly been divisions in the past, but at this point they were platoons. Teutonic Order, Loki's Strife, and Thor's Hammer. So this was all StarCraft. The different platoons were based on different kinds of games or maps within StarCraft, custom games or regular, ordinary StarCraft melee games played by different platoons within the Eye of Odin. So the Eye of Odin was always WA's central division here for many years after this point, and within each of these divisions would be platoons. A platoon would be led by a lieutenant, division led by a captain with a commander or more than one commander to assist the captain. The lieutenant led by an officer staff, including a lieutenant junior grade, and various ensigns and warrant officers, assuming there's enough members to fill all these posts. Sometimes there wasn't, sometimes that could be a problem. Now a pretty huge amount, dozens and dozens and dozens of new platoons would be made during this time, which would include rough platoons, which were originally led by a lieutenant. This was later changed to a Master Chief Petty Officer after a fiasco in which Warrior specifically expressed worries that too many new rough platoons were being approved, and it was giving new members a free jump all the way up the ranks to the rank of lieutenant, when this was undeserved. So he suggested instead Master Chief Petty Officer be the rank of rough platoon leaders. If the rough platoon became successful, then it would turn around and become a full-on platoon, potentially even a division, if it got big enough, got enough members. So this system continued all the way until 2010. Now the Second Empire era begins in 2010, but it wasn't necessarily that Dane felt that WA had reached its zenith. It was, although things had been improving in terms of activity, this was more based on events specifically that caused this. So number one, there's a lot of arguments in the council. Now there was a council, so to speak, within the Third Fleet era, but this was composed of the admirals and a member named Moscow, Heimdall Moscow Wrestling the Triumphant, would arrive on the scene and join the council near the later Third Fleet era. So there kind of arose some factions within the council, and eventually things seemed to boil down to Dane versus Warrior. Warrior felt that he was the only one willing to object to anything Dane said, Meanwhile, Dane in Moscow felt that Warrior was being emotional or causing problems, and even accused him of actually trying to start a rebellion simply by being defiant towards Dane or disagreeing with Dane very frequently. So these things came to a head in early 2010, and Warrior essentially destroyed the WA forum database. He was the administrator of the WA forums at the time. And in sort of an act of defiance, after this conflict came to a head, he did as much, and of course left. As a result, Moscow took over ownership of the forums, had to make a new website and forums. We have since recovered thanks to Warrior, still had a database file. Unfortunately, we have not been able to get it to recreate it in the forums. We have the data, so we can search through it for posts and such. For example, Olfald was able to find the old story of The Tale of Eru, which is a classic Sindar story, originally written by Dane. And we thought that we only had Eru's version that he rewrote from his memory, but we in fact got the original from this database file, but sadly we have not been able to put it all back together and into an actual forum that people can browse again, but at least we do have the data. So, at this point, with Warrior gone and Dane very dissatisfied with the council, he moved to break the council, take back all power himself, and to suggest via a poll on the forums whether WA should continue as a fleet or become an empire. And there is a lot of arguments back and forth either way. I think it's fair to say it was pretty close to a 50-50 split, but Dane was in support of the empire. And generally, whatever Dane was in support of, most people would be in support of. Again, Warrior suggesting he's one of those people who disagree with him. So that was the case here. There's a lot of impassioned arguments against the fleet, against the empire. But it was empire that won out. So the empire was formed in early 2010. Thus began the Second Empire era. Now, I talked about earlier at the very start of the lecture here, but I'll continue a bit. So we did have the empire led by an emperor, and initially there would be fleets within this empire. Once again, the first fleet and the second fleet. Now, there's a lot of different events, and you can go through history and try to find some of them out. New clans merging into WA, new members joining and then quickly leaving. That left things a little bit in flux for some of these fleets. So there is a lot of members fading away in terms of activity at this point. I think the overall average age of clan members went up, which always results in members getting married, having kids, going off to college, going off and getting full-time jobs, etc. Just getting tired of video games, for example. And this overall had a negative effect on the clan, as did the gradual decline of StarCraft, which was losing its player base, and the release of StarCraft 2, which was thought to be amazing, many WA members thought it would be an incredible opportunity. Unfortunately, it really just fell flat as far as an opportunity for clans. There was not a lot of clan functionality, and there's not a lot of custom game functionality. You could make custom games, but you couldn't host them unless they were one of the 5 most popular games. So the system worked very poorly for clans, and so all these factors combined into a gradual decline for WA throughout the Second Empire era, which would actually last from 2010 all the way until 2016. So a 6-year era. So again, the longest to this point in WA history by a long shot. So again, the Second Empire would feature various forms of organization. It was always led by an emperor, but early on there was the multiple fleets, each led by an admiral, and then containing divisions led by captains and platoons led by lieutenants within them, and then separate rough platoons as well within those fleets, led by Master Chief Petty Officers. Moving on from that, there was also the creation of Imperial Knights, which is a rank that had existed in the past in the First Empire era as well. Traditionally, these were kind of free-floating, but veteran, highly skilled leaders and officers whose job it was to kind of help all around the Empire and the clan. So the rank of Imperial Knight existed, and we also had the ranks of Lord Protector, which is the rank held by Moscow for quite a long time as sort of the second in command beneath the Emperor. And he also formed the Varangian Guard and the Praetorian Guard to have various purposes, but these faded away pretty quickly. They essentially, a habit WA often has of creating new posts for old members that are very well respected and considered responsible, but not really active anymore. So rather than wanting to demote those members to the rank of a common member, so for example, even demoting them to Master Chief Petty Officer, WA often has a habit of wanting to give them sort of retirement posts that are quite high, with no real required duties, but a lot of supposed authority still. So this kind of happened. You had members such as Euler, for example, that were not terribly active, but were given high-ranking posts. Puck is another example. And yes, that was the early organization there. Things would shift as well, would wind up with the legions later on. So the first Imperial Legion and the second Imperial Legion. So WA, now still as an empire, was split into legions. Each legion led by a legate, with a second in command, who is the lore master of the legion. So the two legions would kind of be in competition in a way, and would be looking to add new platoons and divisions to their ranks, which they did, and so on and so forth. But again, by this point in 2012, 2013, the clan was really in a significant decline in many ways, and some would not have seen it from certain perspectives, but overall, things were certainly on the decline. So the subsequent years were a lot of time spent trying to find new homes for WA as StarCraft really, really died. These included a ton of different games, obviously various efforts on consoles, Xbox and PlayStation, which never saw too much success. Xbox definitely had the upper hand throughout WA's history as far as success. For example, going back to the second Raven Corps, which was rather successful, and then going into the Van Draren, led by Corsair, which is another Xbox division. So definitely more successful, but certainly never the real headquarters of WA. We also had the Stone Stars from the World of Tanks, who generally were quite successful, and Olaf's Berserkers formed on League of Legends. Now, none of these would ever really fully replace the Eye of Odin, partially because none of them really had the full clan functionality that old StarCraft Battle.net did for WA. Nothing ever quite filled that void that was left over, but some were quite successful. So eventually, things kind of started to break down and were reformed. This would have been about 2013 or 2014, I believe, into the having a sword arm of the Empire and shield arm of the Empire. So ever since most likely the Third Fleet era, but possibly earlier, WA had what they called Knights. Now, Imperial Knights were something else. Knights were basically knight orders, and each house had them. Now, briefly jumping back, houses formed as units of lineage the first time during the, I believe it was the late Second Empire era. Or, excuse me, sorry, the late Second Fleet era. So houses later on would also get their own, it kind of developed their own traditions and culture, and as part of that, it developed knight orders, which were sort of the elite units, the elite special forces, if you will, to use our current terminology, of these houses. So they would play a big part in a lot of WA history, but one thing that they would do at this point, going back to the Second Empire era, was they would all be put under the charge of the shield arm, or excuse me, the sword arm of the Empire, whereas the shield arm was in charge of the traditional chain of command structure, divisions, platoons, etc. Now, at this point, the Knights were kind of in a state of decline. There was a lot of inactivity. Knights are kind of dropping like flies, and as such, new Knights are being trained up and added very quickly, often Knights that were not really up to the old standards, because it used to be quite difficult to become a Knight, and it was a huge deal. So this would factor in later on, but essentially WA would kind of spiral further and further down. As Dane faded a little bit in activity, he looked for emperors to replace him. He would first appoint Share Noble Sindar as emperor, but he would quickly fade away, probably due to having a bunch of kids. Fade away in inactivity, and he was replaced by Skullrus, who was active for quite a bit longer, and did re-energize the clan somewhat in terms of a little bit of activity, but certainly optimism. There is a sense that this was this time things were going to work out with the new emperor. But there is also a breakdown of rules and order, so to speak. A lot of the seriousness of the past was dropped. The idea that rules needed to be enforced and somebody breaking a rule or disrespecting a superior officer was a huge problem started to disappear. Rules on content, what people could say, it used to be that people were not allowed to swear in the channel and you would get banned if you did as much, began to fade away. So things really began to move to a much more casual direction here. But eventually Skullrus would as well fade away into inactivity, and he would be replaced for a time by Vitterolfer, also known as Trooper Grimling, who was the shield arm of the Empire, so he served as de facto emperor, but never actually held the rank. Eventually, he would be replaced by myself, Vesper, and I would become the 4th emperor in November of 2015. Now, at this point, I would start a new era in June of 2016. But one thing that happened during this time was the suspension of all knights in coordination with Dane due to some incidents. At this point, Dane had formed his own division, again in that effort to look for the new home for WA called the Icegrim on MechWarrior Online. Now, the Icegrim were wildly successful, more so than almost any division in WA history. The only problem was they were very detached. They scarcely consider themselves part of WA, and they're not really aware of WA traditions and such. They had a very big Norse theme established by Dane himself, including Norse ranks, but the ties to WA were not there. Dane kind of intended to bring them into WA later on after already establishing them, but that never really happened. So, by this point, the Knights were suspended pending reevaluation because the quality of Knights had decreased and the number had generally decreased, and the feeling was the Knights were essentially failing all across the board to be what they're supposed to be, which was an elite force to uphold the clan's values and activity and organization and success and defend it. But Knights would quickly be reinstated. However, not long after, the Knights were officially disbanded. So I disbanded all Knight orders, again going back to the previous theme, because things had gotten so bad in that department. The thinking was that they would be brought back at some point, but there was a fear now at this point, as things had gotten more casual, that a lot of older members were simply kind of sitting around looking for more awards and medals and not really interested in working for anything. So part of this was an effort to say that people need to earn their keep still. Regardless of what you've done in the past, you need to earn your keep. And we can't just sit around and have a bunch of bad knights and poor knight orders. So they're disbanded for a time, and then we had the first Imperium era, which began in June 2016. So June of 2016, first Imperium era, I maintained the rank of Emperor. However, things changed a bit in the form of the first thing we had was we would establish chapters in place of divisions. So these are essentially exactly the same as divisions, but they would use different ranks. So they'd be modeled after the ranks of the Icegrim, which were Norse ranks. So they include a few ranks such as Thane, Rekka. Chapters would be led by... So initially, they would be led by... now my memory's failing me. I will believe it was captains still. Or was it Primarchs? I think it was Primarchs. Primarch was the rank. So a lot of this was inspired by Warhammer 40,000. And Warhammer 40,000 Space Marines and even the Space Wolves to a significant degree. One group of Space Marines. So, the First Imperium era would see a little bit more flux as some different groups were established. So, at one point, we had these chapters which were individually based on games. Things would change somewhat as the Norse ranks would stick around for quite a long time and see some additional ranks added. Eventually, things switched over to using the rank of Jarl to lead individual chapters or divisions throughout the First Imperium era. And eventually, after a few iterations of these chapters being sort of like Knight Orders, was the idea that there was a successor to Knight Orders. So there was various chapters established for different purposes, such as the Order of Fenrir, established for competitive play and organizing tournaments. The Ulfednar, which was established to kind of teach about WA lore and help out new members and show them around. So these were all established. There's some other ones, such as the Imperial Knights, which was not related to the previous usage of Imperial Knight, established by me to sort of be the leaders and administrators of the clan and serve a very similar purpose to the old Imperial Knights. The only one to ever hold this membership in this chapter, aside from myself, was Eudor the Builder. So these various chapters were tried. Most of them faded away pretty quickly. Some of them saw more success than others. The most successful was most likely the Ulfednar, but none of them saw any real big measures of success. So at this point, things continued to sort of spiral down in terms of relationships between the rest of the clan and the Icegrim. And over time, the Icegrim would essentially leave WA, depending on how much of a part of WA you want to consider them. They were always considered an official part of WA for many years, but eventually they were even removed from their honorary status, if you will. Now, towards the end of the First Imperium era, we did reorganize once again with the officers being knights. So WA was basically the divisions and such were removed, and WA was led simply by knights, a collective group of leaders and officers. Now, this was again a different usage of knights. Knight was essentially just the one officer rank. You had to train as a squire, and then if you passed all of the training, you would become a knight. The training was less intensive than the old Knight Orders used to be, but it was still not easy. So officers kind of worked together with myself as Emperor as kind of the ruling body and administrative units of WA, and worked to create a new system of organization towards the end of 2017 and early 2018. Eventually, after a ton of debate and work, we put together what we call the Viking system, which would be debuted in March of 2018 in the first Viking era, and thus ended the First Imperium era. Now for this, I took on the rank of High King, and everything was Norse-based. You had Jarl. Initially, we had a rank of Skald, whose job it was to know lore, but also to be kind of a second in command of what we called great companies, each of which contained warbands. Great Company was a holdover from the Warhammer inspiration of First Imperium era. Warbands, essentially just the word itself. Certainly some possible inspiration from, say, Mount and Blade, Warcraft, some ties to actual Viking history and ideas, certainly. So you had various ranks, Old Norse-themed ranks. Rekka was the standard rank. Scout was kind of the introductory rank. We had various other terms, such as Framling, being used for guest. And at this point, WA had various great companies and warbands within them. And initially, each warband was simply an arbitrary unit. They weren't based on any specific game, but gradually they developed their own games and identities. Now, the great companies, there's two of them initially, the Companions of Aegir and the Guardians of Rand, both of which would survive nearly till the end of this era. A third was created briefly, the Champions of Yggdrasil, towards the end of the First Viking era, but never saw too much success. It was sort of an effort to fix the declining activity and problems that
Unfortunately, it didn't really do so, at least immediately, and eventually things would be reorganized once again into the current era, which is the Fourth Fleet era. So this would have been about September of 2020. Now, there is a long lead up to this where all these ideas were discussed publicly. We had what we call the first ICER Summit, which is essentially a clan-wide discussion, a bit like the old poll done way back in 2010 by Dane, Fleet versus Empire, which do you want? But this was just a complete discussion of critique of WA, organization, and ideas, a collective opportunity to brainstorm ideas. Using that and putting things together for a long time on the WA Twitch. So this was the first time, essentially, that a clan WA system of organization was created entirely in the public eye. The fleet system returned once again, the form of the Fourth Fleet era. So things were similar, but instead of having a bunch of different admiral ranks, there's just a single rank of admiral and then fleet admiral rank held by myself, the leader. Now, initially, we had no divisions, but we did have platoons. So the old war bands of WA became platoons. It would stay this way for 3 months until all platoons were disbanded, with the thought that with falling activity across the board and the feeling that it was difficult to confine people to a single game via Discord, the way that we could back on in our multi-game days, 15 years ago. Now people play so many games, it's difficult to put them in one individual platoon for certain games. So it created one collective WA once again, but we still maintain the same officer ranks, Master Chief, Petty Officer, Warrant Officer, Ensign, Captain, Lieutenant, Admiral, etc. That was slightly out of order, just so you know. But I did change some ranks, so instead of having the third class, second class, and first class Petty Officer ranks, I swapped things around to having the ranks of Gunner and Master Gunner, which are used in some navies around the world. And in place of the rank of, well, not really in place of one, I suppose. I just added a standard rank of Marine, which is sort of a carryover from the use of the rank Rekka and later Warrior during the first Viking era. And then before that, there's the rank of Recruit, which was a holdover of the rank of Scout from the first Viking era, which was sort of the introductory rank. After a month, you'd move up to Marine. But after 3 months in December of 2020, we changed the system slightly. We added the rank of Reservist. So all current and former members of WA were eligible for Reservist. So if you just didn't want to post in roll call, weren't super active, you'd become a Reservist. So you get access to most of the server still. Most of the server was opened up to even guests as well, so it wasn't so private and restricted. And the idea was that a new recruit could either move on to Marine and try to climb up the rest of the chain of command, the rest of the ranks, or they could simply go over to Reservist. And that's the system we maintain to this day. So that is a history of the organization and command structure. Now, normally at this point I'd ask if there are any questions, but I don't have anybody with me in Cert Hauler right now. So if you do have questions, do feel free to ping me, DM me, comment on YouTube as well, and I will try to answer those. And again, I should be back for future lecture series before the end of the year, hopefully sooner, to make sure people can fulfill that criteria and maybe learn a thing or two. And again, if you would like to host one, do let me know. Anybody can, don't have to be an officer to do so. With that, I think I'll go ahead and sign off and conclude episode 3 of the lecture series, History of the Organization and Command Structure. Hope you enjoyed.